My name is Angus McCullough, and together with Helen Law and Stefano Ruiz, we represent the Category M core participants. In this opening statement, we seek to give at least outline answers to the following questions. First, who are the women in Category M, and what were their common experiences? Second, why are they so important to the inquiry, and how can the value of their contribution be maximised? And thirdly, briefly to consider what are they hoping for from this inquiry and their involvement in it. So the Category M participants were some of the wives, now the ex-wives, of undercover officers. They were the mothers of their children, the family they came home to. They were a vital part of the practical operation, a way of trying to keep the undercover officers grounded and of ensuring that they remembered which side they were on and a tether to normal life. We don't doubt that there are other wives or partners of undercover officers, officers whose conduct will be examined in this inquiry, and potentially many others. But the three women we represent today are the only ones who are here as core participants to tell their stories. So it's worth highlighting at the outset that although, as it happens, the direct experiences of the individuals within Category M falls within tranche 3, the issues that their evidence raises and the same concerns and issues to explore seem bound to be similarly relevant to the earlier time periods in tranches 1 and 2. So the women as wives of undercover officers fulfilled their roles dutifully, both towards their husbands and the honourable causes they believed they were serving, namely the fight against crime, terror and violence, challenges of the highest public interest. These sacrifices came with a heavy price for their own lives and their families, and they believed they were making those sacrifices for all of us, for the public. They have come forward to this inquiry again with a sense of public duty to help answer many of the questions that lie at the heart of this inquiry's terms of reference. They can provide a unique insight both into the effect of the work of the undercover officers and those close to them, as well as into the involvement and conduct of those responsible for managing them. They've come to this inquiry willing to share that knowledge and their experience. They're also hoping that the work of this inquiry will provide answers. The inquiry will hear from many whose most intimate lives have been affected by the practices of undercover policing, heart-rending stories of betrayal and deceit. But there has been little focus on the harm done to the wives of undercover officers. Their sacrifices went way beyond those that they had willingly taken on and have had a shattering impact on each of their lives and that of their wider families, as they've come to learn something of the reality of their husbands' roles. This has cost each of them their marriage and had a profound ongoing psychological impact. They hope that this will come to be recognised and that their voices are heard in this inquiry. So, sir, I turn to some common themes amongst their experiences, and these are set out from paragraph 6 in our written opening statement. Each of the women in Category M has her own unique story to tell and consequences to describe, but there are common themes between them, and I would seek to highlight 4 features of these. First, as I've already emphasised, each of these women were police wives. That was woven into their identity. At the outset, they saw themselves as part of the wider police service, investing in their husbands' careers and also seeing themselves as respectable members of the community. When their husbands joined Special Branch, they felt the shared pride that came with such an achievement, as well as a sense of pride around what their husbands did in helping keep people safe and upholding the law. When their husbands went undercover, they provided the support, unwaveringly. They willingly made all the sacrifices that went with that. They took on the burden of secrecy, unable to talk about the impact on them or their husbands. They lived in fear of reprisals, both at the time of deployment and subsequently when the true nature of their husbands' activities became known. But they believed that their sacrifices were worth it for the cause. They did so without, as they will describe, any proper support from the Metropolitan Police. Years later, they found out that their marriages were based on lies, that their husbands' jobs, of which they had been so proud, had been vehicles for the worst kind of infidelity. They have been left to reconstruct their lives and those of their children, forever tainted by their connection with men who have behaved so appallingly. So what once brought them pride now brings them shame and fear. Second, each saw and experienced the significant and overwhelming impact that undercover deployments had on their husbands and in turn on their families' lives. From the personality changes that they witnessed their husbands undergo, anger or distress from the pressure, and no doubt, as it now appears, the deceit, and the way in which those changes, bit by bit, eroded their marriages and distorted their family life. The officer husband of one of the Category M participants made an urgent demand that they and their young children must move immediately because of a risk that he had been identified by a person whose group he was infiltrating. This demand was reinforced by a personal visit to her home by Bob Lambert, who was by then a senior officer tasked with the management of undercover officers in the SDS. Knowing what she now knows about the undercover officer's activities, she doubts the explanation she was given and believes that she was misled into making such a life-changing move. She knows that this and other significant family decisions were made on the basis at least of half-truths and misinformation. Third, they were all equally blindsided by the revelations that have ultimately led to this inquiry. None of them had any idea that in the name of policing, each of their husbands were having sexual relationships with other women. All were left shocked and devastated by the media coverage as it unfolded and the media intrusion that accompanied it, which affected not only them, but also their children and wider families. Fourth, they were mothers of children born into relationships imbued with deceit. Some of their children were conceived or born during the currency of the very deployments with which this inquiry is concerned. Not only did they have to witness and help as best they could their children navigate relationships with fathers who are absent, angry, or palpably altered by their experiences, sometimes being unable to reveal the truth to protect their children. But in the years that have followed since the deployments ended and the true nature of their father's conduct began to be revealed, they've had to help their children rechart the same relationships with entirely new and shocking knowledge, doing their level best to protect them at such a vulnerable time from the very public fallout and media attention. There was no support in the form of facts to help the children or the women to have a true understanding or certainty as to the actual situation. So I turn then to the question, why are they so important to the inquiry? The impact of their husband's deployment on them and their families is only one aspect of the evidence that these women can give to the inquiry. They were in a unique position. They were both an integral part of the process and exploited by it. And it's those two features, them being an integral part and exploited by it, that puts them in, as I say, a unique and special position in terms of the perspective of their evidence to this inquiry. They had a close-up view of the impact of undercover employments on the undercover officers, and they saw the role the Metropolitan Police played, and just as importantly, did not play, in supporting the officers. On occasion, they met senior Metropolitan Police Service officers in connection with their husband's recruitment and work in the SDS. So each of them has direct evidence to give on what they were told and whether it was borne out by subsequent events. So the function of this opening is not to rehearse the evidence that they will give, but to summarize 5 themes it will cover within the inquiry's terms of reference. From their individual perspectives, they can give evidence to the inquiry about matters that we've identified at paragraph 20 of the written opening from letters A to E. At A, we highlight the recruitment process to the SDS, including indications that the police specifically sought married men so as to keep them grounded. Bob Lambert was a senior officer who told them this explicitly. They will tell the inquiry about the extent to which the MPS did or did not appear to give any thought to what that would mean for the officer's marriage or their children. The lack of any apparent consideration of the collateral and lifelong damage that the undercover work and the undercover relationships, as now revealed, would cause. The strong impression that the women had that they and their families were being vetted for their suitability in that supporting role without any apparent reciprocal assessment of risk to them or their children, either from external parties or from the officers themselves, and the enormous pressure their situation placed them under. And the visits to their homes from senior officers and the encouragement to support their husbands to play their role without any parallel commitment to providing adequate support. B, their understanding of the type of work that their undercover officer husbands would be doing, and the clear indication given to them that the groups to be targeted were serious and violent criminals or extremists, not protesters that posed no significant threat to the officers or their families. This aspect is particularly important given the enormous stress that the fear of reprisals caused for each of the women, both during and after deployments. More broadly, it is significant in the context of the inquiry's consideration of whether the Metropolitan Police was keen to encourage the impression externally that the targets were violent criminals and not the protesters, campaigners, or political groups who were in fact, as it now appears, being infiltrated. When the women found out the truth about the groups their husbands had been infiltrating, they were horrified, as this was at odds with the picture that had been painted to them. C, the practicalities of their husbands' work and its impact on their families, the nights, days, weekends, or weeks away, the work trips abroad that now look as if they were holidays with their unsuspecting partners, or part of the extraction process at the end of a deployment. All this apparently done to maintain the lie of another life. But perhaps most of all, the isolation for them that came with it. Whilst their husbands had fellow officers, managers, and supervisors to share their experiences with, these women had no one. They had never met each other, never even knew the others existed until this inquiry was set up. Such was the secrecy that there was no way for them of finding mutual support in friendships. D is the lack of support, practical and emotional or psychological, that was available to the officers and their families, and the reality of its near total absence, both during and after the deployments, even when it was expressly promised by or sought from the same officers who'd come into their homes and encouraged them in the first place. With one exception, that includes the many years that have passed since it was first publicly alleged that the undercover officers had been having sexual relationships with their targets, which for the wives was the first occasion on which they began to learn something of the true position. At no stage did the police approach them to warn them before, or to support them during, or to offer them help afterwards. And E, they can give evidence as to the level of monitoring and supervision of officers, which at times of one officer appeared to one of the women to be near daily, undermining any suggestion that those more senior in the SDS did not know what was going on the ground. Thus, sir, we submit that although the women in category M are small in number, the evidence that they can give is of the highest relevance to the central issues of this inquiry. For them to be able to maximize their value to the inquiry, as they wish and hope to do, and likewise maximize the quality of the evidence that they can give, it is important that the women are provided with the level of disclosure which recognizes their role and their existing knowledge and experiences. So they will ask the inquiry to trust them in that process in the same way as the Metropolitan Police has trusted them over many years to keep their husbands' roles confidential. A trust that, I should say, each of them has scrupulously honoured throughout. They, in turn, place their trust and confidence in the inquiry, that it will rigorously and transparently pursue answers to the questions before it. To that end, the officers' wives are determined to provide every cooperation and assistance that they can. Finally, I turn to consider what the women in category M hope for from this inquiry. They hope for three outcomes. First, they want some recognition of their existence and their roles, of the impact and damage on them and their children. They can see the apology from the Metropolitan Police, hard fought for, which has been received by some of the women who were targeted by undercover officers. An apology which was repeated by Mr. Skelton in his opening statement on behalf of the Met yesterday. They cannot understand why they have not received an equivalent apology, and why the Met has passed up this latest opportunity to acknowledge the wrongs that they too have suffered. They sacrificed so many aspects of their lives for the police, and not once has anyone from the Met acknowledged, let alone apologised for, what has been done to them and their families. They would like openness, transparency, and answers to many of the questions that the inquiry is posing. Applying the module issues to their own experiences, some of the key things they want to know are: 1, how were their ex-husbands selected for undercover work? How much of a role did the fact that they were married to these particular women play in this? Was the SDS in reality recruiting a package of husband with supportive and loyal wife? And was an emphasis put on family life that created a culture that encouraged the officers to have more children, despite knowing that they were at the same time betraying their wives? 2, when the SDS was recruiting undercover officers, was there any assessment of the suitability of the family unit for this sort of work, or the impact it would have on them, or the risks and pressures that it would expose them to? 3, what explanations, assurances, or undertakings were routinely given to families of undercover officers, and were they true? Were these women lied to by the senior SDS officers they met about the nature and role of their husband's work? 4, what support was offered to the undercover officers? Were there any procedures the women weren't told about as to how they could raise concerns about the impact of the work on the officers or their families? Or was this just not thought about? Why, when they did raise concerns, were they not properly responded to? 5, was there any training or support offered to other partners of undercover officers before or during deployments? And why did these officers' wives not get any training or support? And 6, who within the SDS knew about the sexual relationships between the undercover officers and their targets? Were those relationships encouraged or authorized? Why weren't the women told about the relationships at any stage before they were made public, despite the Met's awareness that that was about to happen? And for the future, they hope for assurances that there is no place in policing for intimate relationships between an undercover officer and an unsuspecting target, that no other undercover officer partners or their families will be exploited as these women have been, or go through what they have been through, that no other women or men will be the victims of sexual deceit in the name of policing. And so in this regard, I have to say that my clients are dismayed at what they have seen and heard from the openings on behalf of undercover officers and former undercover officers, which appear to them to be attempts to minimize this appalling conduct, and reveals even now a disturbing failure to recognize its full significance. And finally, sir, they hope that this inquiry identifies the lessons that can and must be learned from the experiences that these women and the very many others affected by these events and practices have suffered. So that concludes the opening statement on behalf of the category M core participants.